All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, I'm Julianne again, and this is the Industrial Remote Connectivity Webinar Series. This is actually part 2, which focuses on IT security considerations. If you want to check out part 1, it's on OT security considerations. That's on our YouTube page. So before we start, I want to go ahead and let you know about the Q&A window. As always, please type your questions in there, and our panelists will get to it at the very end. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce Vishal Prakash. He is our product manager for the remote connectivity and our IAOT platforms. So now that you know him, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Vishal.
Thanks, Julianne. Hello, everyone. And as Julianne said, this is episode 2 of 3 on industrial remote connectivity. And before I get started, just wanted to say that hope all of you, your family and friends are staying safe and healthy given the current health crisis. Okay, so why are we here? We're here to talk about IT considerations for remote connectivity. Why? Because remote connectivity is very important to maintain OT readiness. And we're going to talk about what OT readiness means. We're also going to touch upon the IT-OT convergence phenomenon that's happening. And you will see during the presentation and how this ties in to the topic we're talking about, which is the IT security considerations for remote connectivity. Okay, so a very quick introduction on who ProSoft is. So ProSoft has been in business for over 30 years, a global organization with strategically located offices around the globe. We partner with major industrial automation vendors to really become their communications arm, excuse me, to become their communications arm. And today, ProSoft's main strengths are in 2 areas. The first is that we really are the best choice when it comes to connecting disparate protocols on the factory floor. So we support over 40 different industrial protocols and over 120 different combinations. We support many of the old classical OT protocols like Modbus, but we also support a lot of the new ones like OPC UA and IEC 61850. The other strength of ProSoft is to transport your data wired or wirelessly, safely and securely. So if you think about the 2 main strengths that I just mentioned, ProSoft really is your first step in sort of any connectivity or IIoT journey. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of definitions, and these definitions are going to help us through as we get going on the meat of this presentation. And the first definition I want to talk about or state is about OT readiness. So OT stands for operational technology. And OT typically deals with the machines and processes. It really is like a combination of the hardware and software used in monitoring and control of industrial machines and processes. And this term OT itself was actually coined to differentiate between IT, which stands for information technology, and ICS, which stands for industrial control systems. ICS was specifically reserved for automation systems. Now, OT's primary concerns, they include safety, which is both machine and human, physical risks on the plant floor, productivity, process quality, and of course, them working with IT, which I think is everybody's favorite. Their key KPI, which is key performance indicator, is to ensure maximum uptime. So OT readiness is a measure of the reliability and availability of these processes, systems, and machines. The next definition is information technology, and we're specifically talking about IT security. So traditionally, IT dealt with any and all things to do with computers, as obvious as it sounds, but it did include both hardware and software. So this included things like, emails and enterprise information systems and printers, the network that connected all of these devices, the network that managed the information flow from a desktop PC through to the enterprise server. So all of this really became IT, and it covered the entire business, focused on the enterprise side. And until recently, typically the IT network was segregated from the OT network, which was generally considered to be on the plant floor for the machines. But as business computers became more connected and networked, they became more accessible, which meant nefarious actors were looking to take advantage of this accessibility. And initially, it was primarily for information. I mean, this is like good old industrial espionage. But the actions of these bad actors, they kind of grew in scale and they became more complex and more dangerous. So that gave rise to that increased emphasis on IT security. And remember, I said that IT is all encompassing, right? It covers the entire organization. So IT security is also covers the entire organization. It really is security like at the enterprise level. And IT security can be broken into 4 different main categories. And these are network security, device security, data security, and cybersecurity. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through each one in detail, but each one of them is very critical, and together they form that that IT security. I'm getting ahead of myself there. The next definition that I want to talk about is IT-OT convergence. As you saw previously in the previous slide, what I mentioned, that increased connectivity, excuse me, and networking meant an increased emphasis on security. But this increased connectivity was not just happening on the IT side, it was actually happening on the OT side as well. Machines became more complex, they became more autonomous, they became more smart. And if you simply just look at the transformation of industry over the last sort of 30 to 50 years, today where we are with Industry 4.0 and digital factory, kind of this is only possible because of connectivity. And even with all of those developments, as of today, approximately only about 50% of the assets are connected, so still a long way to go. So this increased connectivity that was happening both on the IT side and the OT side is what led to this convergence of IT and OT. So IT-OT convergence, it's a new and emerging concept. There are many challenges for many of the enterprises. Certainly it's a long road to get there. But in my opinion, it is something that organizations should undertake because the benefits of IT-OT convergence are many and it is quantifiable. So one of the things that this IT-OT convergence led to is increased information flow. It reduced risks and it reduced costs as well, which if you look at the benefits of that, that means increased productivity, efficiency and optimization. More importantly, better business decisions through better analytics. So this is a topic that's relatively close to me, and I can keep going on and on about how to achieve IT-OT convergence and to address all of these benefits in greater detail. But we do need to move on. I want to make sure that I use your time correctly. But before I do, there is one last thing I'd like to mention. To be really successful with IT-OT convergence and to really reap those benefits that I mentioned about, it is an absolute must to cross-train to really understand each other's roles and responsibilities, and the functions and the operations. And again, you're going to see that as we go through, as we talk about the main topic of this webinar, which is these IT considerations for remote access, you're going to see how this cross-training and this knowledge is going to be very useful. Okay, so the focus of this webinar, like I said, is the security considerations for remote access with a focus on the IT security considerations. And like Julianne said, for those of you missed last week, they are available on ProSoft's YouTube channel, and that covered OT security considerations. So just a reminder that OT readiness is a measure of reliability and availability. It is to have an effective strategy in place to reduce operational risks and maximize uptime. So this includes, when you look at OT readiness, it should include the facility, the processes, systems, and machines. They must be efficiently deployed and operate capably. Okay, so now let's look at those considerations for remote access. Like I mentioned, IT/OT convergence delivers real benefits. Um, it's important to get IT's buy-in for one of the most important tools that OT must have as part of their strategy to deliver on the OT readiness, and that's what they measured on. And that important tool is remote access. So what we're talking about here, what this list is some of those considerations that I think IT would be concerned about when you're looking at a remote access solution. Because we know that OT readiness is very important because ultimately that impacts revenue, it impacts the bottom line. But at the same time, IT's mandate is security. So they want a solution that's secure, that does not compromise the organization in any way. So having their say in the solution, having being involved, these would be some of the considerations that they would look at. So these are policies and procedures, compliance, user access and authentication, encrypted connections, outbound connectivity, maintenance, and then finally an audit trail or a log, a record keeping. Let's go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. So the first one is policies and procedures, and you might think, why is this important? What has policies and procedures got to do with IT security? If you think about it, it's actually fundamental. Imagine having no policies and procedures and simply saying, the OT people simply saying, we want remote access because it tells us. So he said, okay, but then let's say, imagine somebody connecting to the plant and then without any policies and procedures, and training on how it's supposed to work, they could then have access to the entire plant, including the enterprise IT network. And that can be dangerous and it can have, pretty serious consequences. So having policies and procedures that define how remote access should work, the requirements, is absolutely critical. These policies should be visible and all IT and OT personnel should be trained. And in fact, they should be regularly trained so they're fully aware of these and any changes. And that training should then be extended to any service provider, like an external contractor, or a systems integrator or so forth. The next one, we're going to look at compliance. Now, compliance is actually different to IT security that we spoke about at the start. So IT security is all about protection. It's protecting the network and the devices and the data from bad actors, bad intentions. It's more holistic, as you saw, and it covers the entire organization. Compliance, on the other hand, is about following application rules and standards that's more specific to the application. So like, for example, the compliance requirements or the compliance rules for food and beverage would be different to that of a nuclear power plant. So IT will want to know if the solution that OT is looking at, does it meet these application requirements? Typically, in my experience, a compliance discussion can be pretty touchy between both OT and IT because they're looking at it slightly differently, right? They're looking at it with respect to their own KPIs. So what ends up happening is compliance is really more of a business-driven decision rather than sort of a technical, and the resolution of what's required is more of a negotiation. IT might say, no, this is what it has to be, and then OT says, well, this is my KPI. These are the things that we can do to mitigate the risk so we can move forward if this compliance is there or part of compliance is there and so forth. So it's really is a negotiation rather than sort of a hard technical requirement. Okay, so the next one is user access and authentication. In this case, IT is just looking more for something that's got a username and password. Something with just a username and password is really not that secure today. Like, for example, they want to know if the solution that OT is looking at, does it follow or can it be compatible with the company's login policies? Does it do things like support multi-factor authentication? And if it does, how is that implemented? Is that implementation secure? Does it follow the right security standards. Can that process itself, like I said, can it be amalgamated into the organization's existing login policies? Because that would then allow IT to manage the application access and the user access. That is pretty advantageous. But if it's not, then they'd want to know how users are managed. Is the user data? So, for example, the login activity, is that accessible? Is that stored somewhere? Is it safe? So they really they would be coming in again from that enterprise level, but what they're really looking to see is the solution secure? At the same time, does it satisfy your requirements, which OT would have looked at it, but ID is coming at it from a different perspective to say, does it meet the organization's security requirements? The next one, this is encryption. I mean, this is a given, it's a basic. IT will definitely demand for a secure and encrypted service. At a bare minimum, they're going to be asking for 256-bit AES encryption, which stands for Advanced Encryption Standard. So what that basically means is that any data, when remotely connected, is randomized. So even if the connection itself is compromised, the data is not. This next one, there's an interesting concept, outbound connection. So again, this is important to IT. And why is it important? So before I can explain the why, let me explain what's the difference between this inbound and outbound. So inbound is when so the device or the end device, the remote access device is initiating a connection request to the outside world. Outbound is when the device responds to the connection request. So what you want is outbound, right? I mean, if you think about it, you really don't want the machine to be connecting to the outside world by itself. It would be pretty dangerous. So you only want the device, the solution that you're looking at, to only support outbound connections so it can respond to requests but never initiates one. Because remember, the idea with remote access is that it's an important part of the strategy to maintain OT readiness. And OT readiness is basically high availability and reliability. So really what IT is looking at is say, okay, are you looking for a solution that's going to help or is going to cause more problems for me? All right. The next one we have is maintenance. Again, another important factor for IT. Remember, I said that IT has responsibilities for the entire organization. And now with this convergence of IT and OT, it adds to their workload, and nobody wants more work. I mean, we're all in that same position. We're all doing more than before. So nobody is looking to add to that workload. And remember that OT's requirement is continuous, right? In most cases, it's 24/7. So what IT wants, or what they would like for the solution to be, is something that is low maintenance but reliable, something that's available, highly available but secure, and something that where they have visibility, but it's easy to use for OT. And the visibility is to measure the impact of the solution that would have on their network. So, and then some of the other things that they might look at it from a maintenance perspective is like, does the solution require licenses to be maintained? Is there software that needs to be maintained? If it is a specific device, for example, that's being used to enable that remote access, then how does that device sitting on the plant floor for that machine cell, how does it impact the IT network? Is there an impact? And if it is, what it is, how is that device managed, and who manages that device? And they would be interested in, for example, are there any notifications that could help them to say that, the system is down or the solution is not working, and what kind of information can they get out of it? So maintenance is actually, again, something that's important. There's a lot to it, but fundamentally here, what they're looking at is something that is sort of very secure, but at the same time, super reliable, super available, and super easy to use for the OT team. The last factor, the last consideration for IT is records, or what we call as an audit trail. So this is important because if you think about it, without records, without a log of what's happened, like you don't have an insight when there is an incident. And the idea with these logs, with these audit trail is, when there is an incident, is not so much to go and blame anyone, but the idea is to use this information for continuous improvement. And the idea is to say, okay, what causes the root cause, and then fix that issue so it does not happen again. And having that record keeping is extremely important for that. So in summary, we can say that IT is responsible for the full enterprise, and their primary objectives are performance and security. Increased connectivity and networking at the enterprise level and on the factory floor means an increased focus on security, and we saw that. And then we saw how IT-OT convergence can deliver real quantifiable benefits that does ultimately at the end benefit the organization. And then IT should be part of the remote access solution selection because we know that remote access is critical to maintaining OT readiness. Okay, just a couple more slides. So remember, we said that this is a trilogy. So it's a 3-part series in the webinar. So here's a sneak peek of what we'll be talking about same time next week, the conclusion. We will be looking, we spoke about OT consideration and IT considerations, and I'll bring that home to a solution, a remote connectivity solution that really has been reimagined. And you're going to see why next week. I'm really excited about that. And I look forward to seeing you and more people next week to talk about the solution. The idea there is because we know that remote access enables OT readiness, is to have a solution that is both OT friendly and IT secure. So we'll talk more about that next week. So with that said, that's the end of my presentation. I will now open it up for questions.
Okay, very good. Great information. Let's see, some questions I have here. Okay, here's one. It says, you raised some valid points today, but my IT seems unmoved. They think remote access is very unsecure, and now I'm spending a lot of unnecessary money to keep my downtime to a minimum. How can I convince them?
That's a good question. Hopefully the information I covered today would be useful and you can go and take it back. But ultimately, I think a lot of this is to do with that. If you remember at the very end of that IT-OT convergence slide, I mentioned why education between IT and OT is very, very important. Because without that understanding, both teams are operating on different metrics. If you look at IT, it's security. If you look at OT, it's availability and reliability. So because they're coming from a different perspective, there's always going to be this thing. So the only way to solve that is really through education. Is for both to be fully involved in the process, to really understand what the solution provides. Does it satisfy all the criteria? And it's only after that education, that understanding of why you need something can, in my opinion, will IT be on board to remote access? Because quite frankly, their concerns are valid. I mean, all we have to do is look at all of the different breaches that are happening and so forth. So IT's concerns are valid. It's just that educating them on why remote access is so critical to maintaining OT readiness, especially given today's situation with COVID. I think getting them to understand that process and getting them to understand that requirement is going to be the key in getting IT on board.
Right, okay, that makes sense. Okay, here's another one. It says they currently have a remote access solution. We turn it off when we don't use it and then turn it back on. Sometimes it doesn't connect. How do we solve this problem?
That's a good one. Again, I think this was probably one of the more common forms of remote access in the old. I agree, it's not really an ideal solution because especially if it has to reconnect to go through all of the authentication processes and all of that stuff. There may be a number of reasons. For example, if you're using cellular, maybe it's not connecting to the cellular network, or maybe during the time it was off, something else happened. The service changed, or where it's connecting to, that changed. So there's lots of things that could go wrong, like turning off something and turning it back on is not really ideal. It's primitive. So what you really should be looking for is a solution that's always on, but at the same time, you kind of got control over it, so you know when somebody's connecting to it and how long are they connecting and so forth.
Right. Okay. Okay. Here's one from an electrician. I work in an older plant as an electrician. We make different type of sausages. Will remote access work with an old automation equipment?
Very good question, and I love sausages. Look, it should work because typically what you're talking about is not so much remote access is to give you an access point to your machine, to your network. So if it is an older machine and let's say it's not networked, there are ways of getting remote access specifically to a machine cell or to one specific machine. And as long as it's networked, then you would be able to connect and be able to do the changes or whatever you need to do on that machine.
Okay. Okay. I have another one. It says we make chocolate wrapping machines. Oh, that sounds good. And our products are used globally. Everyone has different IT rules. How do we combat this? It's interesting.
That's a very, very interesting question. Again, in my opinion, I think it's to do with education. Many of the factors that we went through today are fairly common factors, but yes, some organizations might have slightly different. So for example, there might be an organization where it is an absolute requirement for the login processes to be amalgamated with your existing policies. So if the solution does not comply with that requirement, then it's likely that they may not be using it. So it really is education. It's understanding what the solution can offer and getting that buy-in from both OT and IT. I said because they're looking at it from a slightly different perspective. It's having that negotiation and that training to make sure they really understand what each other's requirements are and moving on from there. But what I discussed today are fairly generic IT requirements that should satisfy most of the cases.
Right. It sounds like it's all about education between the two.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me just pause a little bit longer to see if there are any more questions coming in. In the meantime, this will be available on ProSoft's YouTube channel within the next day or so. And also, as a reminder, you guys can go visit part 1, which talks about OT security considerations on the YouTube channel. And it looks like we don't have any more questions as of yet. Do you have anything to add, Vishal?
No, I don't. Apologize. Sorry, I think we've run a couple of minutes over. But yes, thank you everyone for your participation, for attending. And we look forward to seeing you all next week again.
Very good. I'll close it out. Everybody have a good week. Thank you.
Thank you.